Hey everyone, so the Game Awards just put out their big list of nominations for all their categories, and well, it's kind of been the talk of the town for the past few days. So I thought that I would make another quick video just to try and get some of my thoughts off my chest about it. I did make a community post a few days ago to sort of get the general reaction and vibe to this news, but it also became immediately evident that my opinion was in a significant minority, so I think I want to try and make my case here. So, first, I'm actually just going to use this as an excuse to talk about all the nominees real quick, and then we can dive into the real meat of the controversy. So, first things first, we've got Astrobot, and I think that this is really interesting because I feel like Astrobot was barely talked about by anyone before it released, but by the time it came out and people actually got a chance to play it, it basically was heralded as the game of the year contender pretty much overnight. Like everyone was on board with this thing, if not winning, at least being nominated without a second thought. And I mean, hey, I love this game too. I beat it to 100% completion, so like they clearly must have done something right. And in fact, I am planning on making a video about Astrobot once I finish recording this one, so make sure to subscribe if you want to check that out. But yeah, I think most people can agree with this game's place here. Then we, of course, have Balatro, and I feel like the only real controversy here is between people who haven't played Balatro and don't get it versus people who do. And Balatro can easily be one of those kinds of games where, like, if you haven't actually tried it for yourself, it can easily just come off as this, like, weird, cheap looking indie game. But once you play it and you really get addicted to its formula, I think most people understand why it definitely belongs here. Hell, I don't think it'll actually win, but I personally want it to win just because I think that it would be great if this random little indie game made by like one person managed to beat out all of these insanely big AAA games in the industry. But yeah, then we have, of course, Black Myth Wukong, and I'll be totally honest here. This is the one game that I basically haven't played at all. Like, it's kind of flown under my radar. I mean, I've heard of it, obviously, and I've really only heard good things. It seems like a really solid action game, but I just haven't really had the time to check it out myself or even really watch any streams of it or anything. But like I said, I've only heard good things, and I know it's sold really well, so I understand it being here. Then, of course, we have Metaphor ReFantasio, which just is amazing on pretty much every front. Like, I haven't gotten very deep into it myself, but everything I've seen from the combat system to the insanely over the top music to the art direction to the storytelling just seems just overall great. And I'm sure that it only gets better the deeper into the game that you go. But then, of course, we have Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And I think that there's a sort of micro controversy with this pick, only because it is technically a remake, and remakes in general definitely feel like cheating to some degree. But at the same time, I think there's a clear difference between things like the FF7 remake and stuff like, say, the Dead Space remake or the Resident Evil remakes. Like, a lot of these do a great job of updating the source material with modern graphics and controls and whatnot. I'm not trying to say that those other remakes are bad by any means, but the FF7 trilogy so far has been a massively over the top endeavor. Like, the fact that it's even a trilogy at all, and that each of these games so far has been the size of an entire AAA sized video game alone, I think says enough about how much extra effort they're putting into this particular remake. Like, if this was just a one-to-one perfectly faithful remake of FF7 with just a fresh coat of paint and maybe some updated mechanics, then yeah, I would absolutely understand not wanting to qualify it for competing for Game of the Year. But I think it's pretty clear that this remake in particular is a pretty significant cut above the rest when it comes to remakes. They are doing far more than just retelling the original story, so I think that they deserve their spot. But that, of course, brings us to the real controversy, which is, of course, the presence of Shadow of the Erdtree, which is, of course, Elden Ring's latest DLC, as a Game of the Year nomination. Now, most people's immediate reaction to this, including myself, I will admit, is that this just kind of feels wrong. The idea of a DLC being nominated for Game of the Year when it's not even a standalone game that you can buy just feels wrong on many levels. And according to the poll I put out, the vast majority of people think that it doesn't deserve to be here, or that at the very least it should be in its own category. But like I said, I personally think that it deserves a spot, and I kind of want to try and make a case for its inclusion. Because, like, here's the thing, and forgive me for getting a bit philosophical here for a bit, but we as a species, we tend to like to categorize stuff and fit these sorts of things into neat little boxes so that it makes things easier to organize and understand. But the reality of life is that things often don't fit cleanly into the boxes that we create for them. I mean, I feel like game genres are a great example of just how bad we are at categorizing these kinds of things. Like, hell, since we're talking about it, like, what even is a Soulsborne game or a Souls-like game? Like, I feel like people have a really poorly defined definition of what this genre even is beyond it just vaguely resembling From Software's catalog. Like, is it the slow paced and methodical combat? Well, I mean, I don't think combat has to be slow in order to be methodical, and what it means to be slow in the first place is definitely subjective. I mean, hell, some FromSoft games themselves have been a lot faster paced than others, so I think that this aspect is a pretty ill defined area to base a genre off of. Is it the insane difficulty? Well, again, that's entirely subjective. One man's impossible game is another man's trivial. Is Dark Souls 3 suddenly disqualified from the Souls like genre simply because it is significantly easier than Demon Souls? Is Another Crab's Treasure not a Souls game because it has an easy mode? You know, like, I just don't think that that really works. Is it the respawning mechanic? I mean, honestly, that just seems like a pretty arbitrary metric to judge an entire genre around. Like, I don't think that the way that you respawn yourself and your enemies is the most iconic element of these games. It's just a mechanic of them. And I don't think that a game that in every other metric is like Dark Souls would necessarily be disqualified from being a Souls like just because it didn't have some sort of bonfire equivalent in it. I think you get the idea that, like, the point I'm trying to make is that we create these labels and we treat them as hard and fast rules when the reality is that there's usually countless edge cases that are rarely as well defined as we like to think of them. And I think that Shadow of the Erdtree feels like one of those edge cases. Because, yeah, it is a DLC, and out of context, if you asked me if a DLC should win Game of the Year, I'd obviously say no, of course not. But I'd also argue that a remake shouldn't win Game of the Year, and like I was just talking about with the FF7 remakes, I think that they're a clear exception when you consider just how much effort has gone into those remakes. By that same measure, Shadow of the Erdtree, on its own, despite being a DLC, feels bigger than most AAA games. It has a massive map that's arguably even more fun to explore than base Elden Ring. It has more bosses than I think any of the original Dark Souls games in their entirety. It has tons of new weapons and spells and dozens of hours of lore to read and dissect. I mean, hell, it has its own entire progression system separate from the base game. Like, by every metric that I can find, this DLC on its own is comparable to Black Myth Wukong, which is kind of crazy to think about. Like, I'm pretty sure Wukong is still bigger in terms of content, but the fact that you can even compare them at all is kind of nuts. And I mean, hell, I know it definitely took me longer to get through Shadow of the Erdtree than it took me to 100% Astrobot, and I definitely wasn't trying to 100% Erdtree. So, like, it definitely has enough content to, I think, be considered a full game's experience on its own. I don't think you can really argue against that. By virtually every metric, this DLC could functionally be Elden Ring 2 for all intents and purposes. So then, the argument tends to be that, well, it's basically just piggybacking on Elden Ring, riding its coattails to success. And I mean, would that not also be true for, like, most sequels as well? If you want to make the argument that it's able to reuse a lot of the same assets because it's built on the same game, well, the same is true for many games. Is Zelda Tears of the Kingdom suddenly not a real game deserving of awards simply because it reused the map from Breath of the Wild? I mean, hell, take the Yakuza series. They put out an absurd quantity of games. There's like what, 20 Yakuza games that have come out in nearly as many years. And the reason why they're able to do that is because they're willing to reuse assets between different entries. I mean, hell, FromSoft themselves does this all the time. Elden Ring itself, the base game, has a ton of content that was reused from past Souls games or was made out of content that was cut from those games that were then just added in and polished up for Elden Ring. I mean, how many people freaked out when those goddamn skeleton wheels suddenly showed up out of nowhere in Armored Core 6? Are we really going to fault them for building off of their past library of content that they've already made? I mean, that's arguably a problem with the industry right now, is studios constantly redoing everything from scratch and being unwilling to reuse assets. Like, it burns tons of time and money, and people have been saying that studios need to be more willing to just reuse old assets and not chase these pointless graphics fidelity benchmarks anymore. So, like, ultimately, this argument about Shadow of the Erdtree not qualifying basically just comes down to, I think, the manner in which it was sold. It was not sold as a standalone game. It was a DLC. You have to buy Elden Ring and play through it in order to access it. But like, I feel like that is a weird metric to bar something from winning an award. Like, take Games Pass or the other various console online services, for example. There are games that are exclusive to those services where you need to pay a subscription just to be able to access them rather than buying the product itself. Should we disqualify any game sold through that method? Or maybe you could take the argument about games like, say, the Mass Effect trilogy. Like, yeah, you can buy Mass Effect 3 on its own and just play that as your only Mass Effect experience. But I feel like most people would agree that that is an incomplete experience at best. Like, at the very least, you should play through the first two games, and then you get to transfer forward your story progress. Just playing the last game in that trilogy is not how that trilogy was meant to be experienced. So, does that mean that Mass Effect 3 should be disqualified from winning awards because it's not really a complete experience in that itself? At least not entirely? I just feel like there are lots of ways that we could potentially twist this argument about having to be like a complete experience on its own on its head, and we could disqualify various games that you wouldn't normally consider disqualified. But yeah, other than that, I think that the last argument that I have in favor of Shadow of the Erdtree being nominated is that ultimately the Game of the Year award is about awarding the peak of the gaming experience that came out that year. And I feel like we should be placing as few limitations as possible on what qualifies for that peak experience. Like, some people think that mobile games should be disqualified or that live service games shouldn't count or things like that. And honestly, I say that we shouldn't be so restrictive. If an amazing experience comes out in that year, but it is locked behind being a sequel to an existing game or bought as a DLC or something like that, I think that we should still evaluate it on its own merits to determine if it should qualify to be nominated, regardless of the context surrounding its release. But of course, ultimately, this is kind of an ironic argument for me to be making, considering that, I don't even personally think that Shadow of the Erdtree is going to win. Like I said, I personally think that Balatro should win, and I predict, like, if I'm being realistic, I think that FF7 Rebirth or maybe even Metaphor is probably going to actually win. But I personally still think that Shadow of the Erdtree deserves its nomination. But what do you think? As always, let's continue the conversation in the comments down below. And I gotta admit, for as much as I do legitimately believe that Shadow of the Erdtree deserves its spot as a Game of the Year nom, I also find it difficult to argue against simply adding a DLC slash expansion category and then just calling it a day. And then that would basically remove any and all controversy from this discussion. In fact, I thought that the Game Awards used to have such a category in the past, but apparently they never did. In fact, from what I can find, the Golden Joysticks are the only gaming award show to specifically have a category for DLC and expansions. And even then, that's a relatively recent addition to their roster. So maybe at the end of the day, this whole argument is just kind of a moot point that only exists because of the growing pains and the nature of these award shows. I have a feeling that the Game Awards are probably going to be adding a DLC expansions category in the not too distant future, either next year or the year after, and other award shows are probably going to follow suit. And then at that point, I guess things will be sort of sorted out and there won't really be any argument left. But as usual, thank you all for watching me ramble on about nonsense for a while. If you liked what you saw, make sure to like and subscribe, and I hope to see you all in the next one.